So it's a great privilege to launch this new Biola Hour Chapel with our first guest, Dr. Todd Pickett. That's right. That's right. He's starting his ninth year as a Dean of Spiritual Development, and before that, he was an English professor and the Dean of Humanities here at Biola University. He was one of the most loved professors on campus. People loved taking his Dostoevsky class and his poetry classes. And so with that, he's my boss, by the way. Okay, so
yeah, remember that.
All right,
while we're doing this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's my boss, and it's my privilege to work with him. You know, Todd, he's actually one of the most welcoming and one of the most wisest people that I've ever met, and so it's always a privilege to work with you, Todd.
Thank you.
So let's start this off, Todd. You know, 9 years ago, you did move over from the English side to spiritual development. And the question is, why did you do that, and what prompted you to do that, and what about this position excited you?
Yeah. I do think that kind of was surprising to some that I'd moved from the humanities over into student development. Now, while I was Dean of Humanities, I was also getting a degree in spiritual formation at Talbot.
Yes.
And so I added that to the PhD in literature. So I was kind of preparing myself for something in doing that degree as well. But there's not that much of a leap in my mind between humanities and English literature and theology. And the reason is because story is a big deal for both.
Okay.
Stories at the heart of, of course, literature, of course it is, but also theology, and even at the heart of who we are as humans. If you think about it, we are kind of, look around you. We are all absorbed in stories, right? You've got your TV series, I just finished Stranger Things. I don't know if any of you, We're always absorbed in people's stories, reality TV, movies, TV series. We're absorbed, and that makes sense to us, because we are people who live in time, and we are moving toward goals, and we have a cast of characters in our life, people we consider major characters, friends, parents. We have minor characters in our lives. We have settings we were born into. Yeah. Story is kind of the language of embodied humanity. So, and even when it comes to theology, I think most theologians would agree that our job as Christians is to place our individual stories in the biblical story.
Okay.
We need to be, there's a philosopher named Alistair McIntyre who said, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story am I a part? And so really, knowing who we are in the bigger story, in Christian terms, knowing that we are a character in God's larger story is what leads our life. So for me, kind of stories in literature and then the idea of story in theology, this helps us see our lives and know what to do, where to go, what the purpose is.
Okay. Well, I think that brings me to another question, Todd. I think the question is, in the English class, you're having discussions on literature and things like that. Here, as a Dean of Spiritual Development, it's more like you're developing worship services and you're developing ministries and things like that. So how does that connect, and how did some of your skills from the English side transfer over to spiritual development?
Well, again, I think knowing your story and what your story should be is really coming to understand how you see the world. And as we study the scriptures, as we absorb them, as we worship, that is a training in how we see the world. So again, worship or spiritual formation is this question of what story am I a part, and how do I see things? So for example, think of the inevitable trials and difficulties everyone faces in life. The question becomes, how do I view an obstacle? How do I view a setback? How do I view a disappointment?
Right.
And so, of course, in the literature classroom, we'd look at a character in a novel, Pip in Great Expectations. If any of you have read that. How does Pip work through those obstacles? Stories are all about characters moving through obstacles. Well, our lives, in many ways, are about what do we do with difficulty. So a trial comes into my life. So the question is, how do I now see that trial? Okay. Do I see it in the story of, hey, we're all in competition with each other? That's the story. Do I see my story as reality TV, that I've got to fend off competitors and I've got to dominate people and I've got to, be the best person in every setting?
Right.
Well, that would be one story. But the other story is, wow, God is actually shaping me into a certain kind of person. So while it may be true that people see themselves in competition with me, the question is always going to be, in this struggle, what is the invitation toward the story of becoming more like Christ? Lord, what am I supposed to believe more deeply?
Okay.
So it really is this kind of notion of a character, you and I, moving through the obstacles of life, but asking, what is this leading to? And therefore, how do I see a trial or difficulty? So for me, again, that's part of the same kind of narrative thinking and where the story is going.
Great, great. Well, here, we're in a worship service, right? And I just had I'm wondering, what do you think about worship? And how do you want to develop worship as the Dean of Spiritual Development?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question because, again, that's kind of what we do, Mike. You and I,
what we do.
We invite people into worship settings. I mean, here you are today. And what are we doing? What are we doing together? What is this thing called worship? And I think just a few kind of foundational things, first of all. I mean, one is that worship is not a special activity of Christians. Everyone in the world is worshiping. Everyone in the world is seeking something to worship.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, even take this notion of Twitter or that you're following someone on Instagram.
Sure.
Everybody's looking for something to follow.
Okay.
I mean, our English word worship comes from the word worth. What is worth my time? What is worth my giving my life to? What should I follow? And so the whole world is engaged in worship. Now, of course, it's chaotic, right? I mean, people are worshiping this thing this day and this thing another day. They're following this day, following this the next. So I think the first thing to understand about worship is we are hardwired to worship, you and I. The whole world is. This is, in fact, what we have in common with the world.
Yeah.
We're all seeking to worship something. We're kind of like sharks. We're always moving towards something. And what's critical about that when it comes to spiritual formation is, and I want you to hear this, we become what we love. We become what we follow. There's a new book by James Smith, I recommend it, called You Are What You Love. And so in worshiping, we are returning to follow God because we know we will become what we follow. I love Paul has a nice definition of worship in Romans 12:1. And I think, first of all, we have to get out of our heads this notion that musical worship is all that's involved in worship.
Are you sure about that?
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's not the case. I'm pretty sure that almost every time worship is mentioned in the Bible, it's actually not referring to music.
Okay.
Although music is a huge part of bringing ourselves into God's presence.
That's right.
But Paul's definition of worship is this. This is Romans 12:1. I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, given all that he's done for you, and Paul has unpacked that in 11 chapters in Romans, by the mercies of God, and here it is, to present your bodies as living and holy sacrifices. And then he says this, which is your worship.
Yeah.
So Paul defines worship as presenting ourselves to God. Given his love for us, it is our response. We present our lives to him. When you walked in today, minimally, you were just presenting yourself to worship. You were bringing your whole self into worship. That is worship. Any place that we present ourselves to God is worship.
Great. Well, that brings me to another question, Todd. A lot of times in the middle of the semester, it's hard to get up for chapel. It's hard to get up to worship. It's hard to, I have a lot of things on my plate. There's too many things going on.
Mike, this is your job to get up for worship.
This is my job, and
do we need to talk about that?
I come to chapel all the time. You're right.
Right.
But as a student, let's say, it might be hard for me to worship because I don't feel like worshiping. Or when I'm worshiping, the person next to me is really into it, and I'm just kind of not there, And it's just how do I engage in worship in those times as well?
Yeah, right. So the question is, some days we don't feel like it, and therefore are we not worshiping? When you come in and you see somebody kind of singing at the top of their lungs and their arms are raised, their eyes are closed, and you're thinking, I don't feel like that right now. Am I therefore failing in worship? And I think we have to have a little more kind of, a little broader notion of what worship is. I think sometimes we think that worship is only successful when I am filled with love and devotion for God. In other words, especially when we gather in these corporate settings, we think worship is when I am just filled with love for God. And I'm not worshiping if I'm not. And I, to be honest with you, I think that's a very kind of high view of ourselves. I think we're giving ourselves a little too much credit. Because if worship is a daily activity, then there are certainly going to be days where I am feeling anxious about my life, where you're here in chapel and you're going, I need to be out there studying for that exam. Or where you're not feeling a great love for God. You may have been filled with love for other things. You maybe haven't thought about God for a day or two or three, really, in any kind of serious way. Right. There may be, you may be looking at your own life and go, I am just failing as a believer. And so you're not filled with this grand vision of yourself as devoted to God. I would say that by walking in here and just honestly saying, Lord, here's where I'm at. I present my body to you. I mean, in a sense, our worship gatherings are teaching us to come to God no matter where we are that day. And then let him invite us. So to worship is to let God call you in no matter what state you're in. And I would actually say that the kind of more, I don't want to compare kind of acts of worship, but I would say a serious worshiper is one who, when they do not feel like connecting with God, when their heart is divided, they still return. And they say, take my life and let it be. So worship is responding to God in whatever state we find ourselves in. It's not an expression of how much we love God all the time, because you know what? We don't. And yet God is still pleased by the return to say, Lord, shape me. I present myself to you.
Great. That sounds actually really freeing. I can be myself as I worship God, and I don't have to feel all of that all the time.
Yeah, take the pressure off. Take the pressure off saying, I have to kind of be this person who's always filled, because it's really a practice in just honest worship. I'm returning to the truth, what's worth, but I'm also letting it sometimes humble me, and maybe we don't like to be humbled.
Right.
But you know what? God likes us to be humbled, as long as it results in our need for him.
You're right. So here's our first question, okay? This is a text-in question. It says this. This is sounding a lot like what we do in church or in other settings where the body of Christ meets together. In what ways is Biola a unique worshiping community? Let me read it one more time. This is sounding a lot like what we do in church or in other settings where the body of Christ meets together. In what ways is Biola a unique worshiping community?
That's a great question. Actually, what I want to say real quickly, and I don't know for those of you who may be listening on the later kind of production of this, but in between the song that Eunice sang, I mean, it doesn't get much more eloquent than that. Worship is about Jesus' calling. And we come to the altar to where God's arms are open wide. And that's almost a kind of a sung version of Romans 12:1, that to present our bodies as living sacrifices. What the Romans would have heard is, they would have known what a sacrifice is. It's something that's placed on an altar. So that was lovely, and it was a great representation. So how is the worship we do at Biola related to the church community? How is it different? Well, I think I want to say, first of all, that it's similar. And the reason why it's similar is both the church and the Christian college, in this case Biola, are disciple-making communities. I mean, for those of you who are new, freshmen transfers, you out there? Okay. You heard Dr. Corey speak to you, I think it was last Saturday night, and he emphasized that Biola is a disciple-making place, and so is the church. So in that sense, Biola and the church have that in common. We are both making disciples. And worship is what defines a disciple, someone who is always presenting themselves to God to be called. And so it makes sense that both the church and Biola would engage in worship. It wouldn't make sense for us to eat together, live together, study together, be in clubs together, be in ministries together here, and not worship together. That would make no sense. And so Biola, while it's not the same as the local church, and for those of you who heard Andy Draycott speak on Sunday, absolutely, the local church is your long-term home, and it should be your home now. But Biola is an arm of the church. And the unique opportunity we have here is to actually practice worship daily. So with the church, you're kind of, maybe a couple times a week you get to gather corporately. Here you at least have the opportunity to gather daily. This is almost like worship boot camp, kind of preparing you to present yourself in all places and at all times. So we have a special opportunity to do what you are called to do in the local church now and in the future.
Great. Thanks for answering that, Todd.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question. This is from Micah. He asks, if the feeling of love towards God isn't the substance of worship, then what is the motivation of us engaging with it? Especially since emotions are such powerful motivations.
Yeah. Right, well, that's a great question. The question of feelings, of course, feelings are actually pretty important in this sense. Feelings tell us what is true about ourselves right now. And that's important to engage with. So if I'm feeling really anxious, well, that's good information, right? Because at least at the moment that I'm feeling really anxious, my level of maybe belief in God's love and providence might be a little low.
Yeah.
So my feelings are important insofar as they kind of tell me sometimes what my deep beliefs are at the moment. So emotions are important windows to the soul. They're not necessarily reliable in terms of what is true out there, but they're important to pay attention to. Because ultimately, yes, I do want to grow in my love for God. I do. Our theme this year is undivided, which is a prayer, and I'll talk more about this on Monday. But give me an undivided heart is the prayer of the psalmist. So ultimately, yes, we do want to be filled with the love for God. This takes time.
Yeah.
And so the motivation, when we come to worship on days when we're not feeling it, the motivation is, what is the picture of the good life that motivates me? So while I'm not maybe feeling it, I'm going to return to worship. I'm going to present myself to God because I know that is the good life. The good life is to keep moving toward a uniting of my heart.
Yeah.
And so I'm motivated by a vision of the good life, of one who walks in God's ways because that's where life is found. Even if today my life is drawn toward other things, I've got to hold that vision that the commands of God, including to worship, are a call to life. And so what brings me back to worship is I want to find life.
Yeah.
Even if today I'm not feeling it.
Great. Is it safe to say then habit develops the good life, and our good life is a connection to God, is a relationship with God in more
Absolutely.
deep ways? And so if I present myself to Him in happiness and in sadness, in the positive feelings and negative feelings, I'm able to present my whole self to God and connect to Him in all of the areas of my life.
And I think that's important, Mike, because as we talk about worship, you may be thinking about our gathering here, and this is kind of a practice of worship. But if we take Paul's definition of presenting our lives to God, you leave here, you practice worship here, and you leave here to do worship in every place, which means every place you present yourself to God. I like to think of doorways as a good reminder.
Yeah.
I just taught on John 10 in Thursday morning prayer chapel. Jesus says, I am the door of the sheepfold. And literally the shepherd would lie across the sheepfold. He wouldn't build a door, he would lie across it. And in John 10, it says, whoever passes in and out through me will find pasture, which is a word for finding life, a phrase.
Yeah.
And so I always think of doorways as a reminder. I'm walking into class. Lord, I present myself to you. I may not get why I'm in school today. I may not see the connection between this class and life, but you have called me to this life. And so I walk in the door and I present myself to you. Lord, what are you teaching me? What are you calling me? Going to have coffee with a friend, I walk in through common grounds, the doorway. Lord, I don't know where this conversation is going to go with this person.
Yeah.
But I present myself to you. I want to listen. I want to love this person. So worship is this habit of entering into every place, just opening ourselves to God, letting Him call us. And the call might not be something just to do. It may be something to receive. I may be walking into my dorm and saying, Lord, actually, a good example is walking into a test. And I may be feeling, I'm only as good as my grade. And the call there is to receive your sonship or daughtership with God as you take the test, that it's all dependent on you. So again, this notion of presenting ourselves to God is a worship in every setting. It's the habit of opening unceasingly to God. And you can actually do two things at once. You can actually take a test and at the same time have a posture of kind of resting in God. It takes practice, and that gets back to your notion of habit.
Wow. So I'm taking tests, I'm taking a test, and that's worship also.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, that kind of goes to the next question, and this is a Texan question. If worship is a practice in coming to God honestly, how do I express anger towards God? And what does that look like?
Yeah, well, so in the second semester this year, as part of our theme of Undivided, we'll be looking at the Psalms. And the Psalms have always been kind of the prayer book of the Christian church. Because in the Psalms, I think you find every emotion that is common to us as human beings. And, fully 1/3 of the Psalms, 50 out of 150 are lament psalms. Now, those won't all be anger, but they're obviously expressions of disappointment. They're obviously expressions of, God, where are you? How have you allowed this? So we have a huge model in the Psalms of honest prayer. Now, and then that's the fruit of that will be intimacy with God. I mean, think of people that you're always polite around, that you never speak your heart to. Well, that may be a kind of a nice conflict-avoiding relationship, but you don't feel close to them. You're always kind of, keeping your heart out of it. So I think expressing our honest feelings toward God, including anger or disappointment, creates intimacy with God. But if you read the Psalms, what you will see, though, is having kind of expressed this to God, they now open, well, Lord, what do you want to say to me? So many of these Psalms come back around to the person now saying, okay, Lord, I know I don't see the whole picture. This is honestly where I'm at, but I open now. How do I make sense of this? What are you calling me to in the midst of this? So I think we express anger like we express anger in other kind of relationships. However, we do it ultimately humbly, saying, Lord, I don't see the whole picture.
Yeah.
So we kind of let that bring us into intimacy with God. And what's also nice about that is if we're angry at other people, we can go to God first and kind of work it through with him so we don't visit that anger inordinately on other people. So there's a sense in which we let God process that with us so that we don't then dump on other people. And there's a place for anger with other people, but I'll tell you, that takes a lot of discernment.
It does.
You have to be, because I know people talk about righteous anger, but we are not that righteous. And so processing that with God is important to human relationships.
Yeah, and even for me, in my experience, when I'm able to express my anger to other people, I actually feel like those people really get me. And those people really love me because they're able to handle my anger. But anyways, just a little...
Yeah, well, when you're angry at me, I get you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. Thanks for being that kind of boss.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Like God. No.
Like God. God, Todd, it rhymes, right? Okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's the only similarity.
here's another question for us, okay? What disciplines of worship have been particularly meaningful for you? How can someone who isn't familiar with that discipline begin the habit of entering into it?
Yeah, so I am normally reluctant to talk about my own personal spiritual disciplines because sometimes people feel like, okay, I need to do that. And again, the disciplines you choose to engage in at any given time need to be very particular to you. The Holy Spirit is working with you and your particular history, your backgrounds, calling you to particular practices at given time. So I say this kind of encouraging you not to necessarily just kind of take this as your own discipline. But I think for me, I tend to run a little bit anxious as a person. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit of a worrier, and there's a lot to worry about in the world. So one of my disciplines is simply prayers of trust, where someone has said that all prayer is ultimately surrender. And that's true. Even if you think of intercessory prayer, praying for others, you're saying, I am praying because I cannot be God for this person. I have to hand this person over to God. I surrender. So one of my acts of worship is when an issue comes into my life, I just say, Lord, I surrender this to you. Now, it doesn't mean it's passive. I ask, Lord, what are you calling me to? But often I confront my limits very quickly. Yeah. I can't change other people. I can't change circumstances. And so that is more of a posture. I almost do it with open hands, like, oh, Lord, take this. And that's a daily activity for me because I'm sorry to say, the older you get, the more you find that you can't control in life.
Yeah.
And we have to surrender and trust God.
Great.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.